To the audience online and in the room, welcome to today's panel, Restoring Trust in the FDA. Our vision here at the Greenwall Foundation is to make bioethics integral to decisions in healthcare, policy, and research. Two key ways in which we do that is by funding bioethics research and investing in bioethics leaders. Earlier this year, the Foundation set its strategic priorities. One of these priorities is to increase bioethics impact on policymaking. As underscored by the complexities of the last few years, it is critical for bioethics to be at the table when public policy decisions are made. We are working to make that happen. I welcome today's discussion as an opportunity to bring ethics into direct conversation with current policy issues. And I look forward to the interplay among concepts like trust, responsibility, accountability, and practicality. This is a special event for the Foundation to mark the 20th anniversary of our Faculty Scholars Program. This flagship program boasts over 60 scholars from more than 40 different institutions, each with a different perspective and focus. 4 members of our scholars community are featured on the stage today. Now, a few housekeeping items before we begin. We will have 20 minutes for questions and answers from the audience at the close of our panel, and we'll read out as many questions as we can. If you are in the room, we have cards on which you can write your question. You can hand them to a staff member, pass them up to me. If you're looking for those cards, we'll make sure to get them handed out shortly. If you are online, there's a question box underneath your live webcast player. Please feel free to submit a question there. We will also be live tweeting today's discussion. You can join the conversation using hashtag FSP20. Closed captioning is available on the webcast. And last but not least, we will be recording today's discussion and sharing it following the event. The recorded webcast will be available on the Greenwall Foundation's website as well as our YouTube channel early next week. And we'll also send out a link to those who have registered for the event online and in person. I am now pleased to introduce today's moderator, Adam Feuerstein, senior writer for Staff News, co-host of the Read Out Loud podcast, and 2021 George Polk Award winner, who has written extensively about the FDA from many perspectives. Welcome, Adam. I leave this group in your incredibly capable hands.
Michelle, you guys hear me? Michelle, thank you so much, and thank to the Greenwall Foundation for inviting me to moderate and to be part of this, and welcome to everyone here in the audience and everyone virtually. I'll say a few introductory remarks and then introduce the panel. Issues of trust are, it's something that is affecting scientists and regulatory agencies and politicians and even members of the media. We were remarking earlier that it's amazing what has happened where things that sort of bedrock example or bedrock principles of science are now under attack, and that has certainly impacted the FDA. There have been a remarkable number of events in the last several years where the FDA has made very contentious decisions, set some policies that have angered people, and kind of engendered a lot of debate. And so I think we want to talk about just issues of trust, and sort of, the topic of this panel is restoring trust. And so that obviously presupposes that the FDA has lost some of our trust, and we want to kind of get into some of those issues and talk about them in more specifics. And so with that said, let's introduce the panel. And here to my left, we have Jason Karlowich, who is a professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania. Next to him, we have Keith Walu, who is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Welcome.
Thank you.
We've got Holly Fernandez-Lynch. She's Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania. And finally, we have Aaron Kesselheim, Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Everyone, guys, thanks for being here. Let's open up this discussion. Aaron, I'm going to go to you first, and it's kind of a foundational question. What does it mean to trust the FDA? Give us your thoughts on that.
Sure. So first of all, thanks to the Greenwall Foundation for organizing this and for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm really, the Greenwall Foundation is a really special and important foundation that funds work in bioethics. It's unique in that way, and to be here for 20 years of to celebrate the people who have come through it and who have been affected by it and been able to be supported by it is really special. So I'm glad we're having this discussion today. But to talk about trust in the FDA, I think that the trust has two major components to it. I think the first is the trustworthiness of the FDA, or what sorts of rules are in place that should engender trust within the FDA, what sort of expertise and how does the FDA follow those rules, what sorts of people are at the FDA, and I think this is a very important part of trust because the FDA touches so much of what we do. It's the most important public health agency, in my view, in the U.S., if not the world. And it, about a quarter of the economy comes through the FDA. So the idea that there is an entity that exists that is worthy of trust in it and is able and has rules and is able to follow those rules in ways that are intended to promote the public interest is really a fundamental part of it. And then I think the other part of it is the trust that people have in the FDA, and so how well the decisions and issues that the FDA covers are then translated to the people who are affected by it, and how well patients and physicians understand what comes out of the FDA, how well that information then gets translated into practice, so that it can actually positively and measurably affect the various people who depend on it. So to me, those are the two different components of trust.
Keith, when you think about trustworthy in FDA, what sort of behaviors, actions would you expect to see from an agency that has engendered trust?
Good question. I mean, so what I would say, just by way of framing the trust dilemma, is if in the course of 2 years you have both the Committee on Oversight and Reform and the New York Times reporting on the fact that McKinsey, which has settled a lawsuit, $600 million for its role in supercharging the opioid crisis, working with Purdue Pharma, and at the same time has the identical employees who are also working at the FDA, splashed across both, as I said, congressional hearings as well as in the newspapers. You've got a trust problem. That is to say, it raises questions of trust in processes, what Aaron just pointed to, but also trust in leadership. But I think more fundamentally for the FDA, trust in the agency's fidelity to its mission, which is fundamentally about protecting the health of the public and ensuring the safety and efficacy of drugs, of biologicals, and a host of others. And so to me, there's that question. It's a fundamental one. And then I think what each of us also brings to this is that trust question varies depending on the specific entity that is being adjudicated and approved. I work on opioids on the one hand and tobacco products on the other. Tobacco is a fundamentally new area of jurisdiction. Opioids, I would say, has been a long-standing one. And I guess your views about trust really will also revolve around each of those products. And so it's a complicated set of questions that I look forward to building on.
Well, let me ask you a question. What if something that Aaron said is, just the FDA, part of trust is following the rules. And we've seen recent examples, obviously, of the FDA, of flexibility. It's a word that we use a lot when we talk about the FDA and regulatory standards when it comes to drugs. What's your thoughts about kind of where the FDA stands today on this flexibility issue and whether they are kind of adhering to their own rules and procedures when it comes to reviewing and approving drugs?
So I think part of trust is predictability and having the expectation that these are the rules that are going to be followed regardless of who is in the White House and regardless of who the company is, or regardless of who the specific director is, of the particular division or center within FDA. Now, the point of regulatory flexibility is this idea that, we've got statutes on the books that say these are the standards that FDA has to apply. We've got regulations where FDA puts some meat on the bones of those statutory requirements. But then, we have to have some mechanism of figuring out how do these rules apply to the specific facts and circumstances that come before the agency that are variable, depending on what the data look like, what the unmet medical need is, and all of these things. So it makes sense to suggest we need to have some regulatory flexibility, right? The rules, we can't be, slavishly adherent to the rules, but we do need to have some predictability, and we do need to make sure that there's confidence that there will be transparency, right? So part of what we saw, for example, in your reporting on, the aducanumab example, right, where there was maybe some backroom dealings between the regulator and the regulated entity, conversations that weren't being had out in the open through obvious channels that people would expect them to have some insight into what's going on, right? So I think that plays a big role in whether there's going to be trust. Regulatory flexibility reduces the predictability of what the agency is going to do. And I think it causes some distrust because you see different patients viewing FDA as bending over backwards for some disease areas and not for other disease areas. So again, to go back to this aducanumab example for Alzheimer's disease, it seemed like the agency was really breaking its own rules, breaking its own precedent, not listening to its advisory committee. And then you have other disease areas, also horrific diseases like ALS, and you have patients saying, what about us? Why are you holding our disease area, the drugs for our disease, to a higher standard? And so I think that causes a lack of trust in the agency.
Jason, anything predictable about the FDA's handling of aducanumab or Alzheimer's drugs in general?
No,
because that's a great word, because it seems like totally unpredictable.
Yeah, it was spectacular. It was predictably unpredictable. No, I mean, if you had asked me on the evening of June 6th, do you think FDA will approve aducanumab? I would have said no, because part of the conversation was what was not part of the conversation, which is the use of the accelerated approval regulations. And I think for many, it felt like kind of a bait and switch, to use a bit of a jargony term. But it felt like you went to court, you made your case, all the evidence was presented, discussion occurred, and the judge came back with a completely different ruling on the basis of a totally different set of law that wasn't the topic of conversation or in the hearing. And I think that alone made me in particular, feel like I have a real hard time trusting what the agency's going to do here, because they hold a hearing for regular approval, standard approval. They almost bat away the idea of expedited approval, and then a few months later pop out expedited approval as the mechanism. To add to that, what was equally vexatious was in the subsequent weeks to follow, the defense, the explanation by FDA was, well, we sought the voice of the patient, the voice of the afflicted, and they made it very clear to us that accepting some degree of not just risk but uncertainty would be tolerable in the pursuit of benefit. And it turned out that that was a January meeting that was held with 3 caregivers and 6 patients. And when we wrote to say, well, is there a report from that meeting? Is there a set of findings? The answer was, we have nothing to produce to you. So there too, well, I'm not, by all means, seek out the voice of the afflicted, but I think a process issue that has to now be thought about is, what's a reasonable way to do that? And I don't think having private meetings with a small number of hand-curated individuals satisfies that. I think one left again feeling this was just unreasonable.
Keith, how much damage to credibility and trust has happened with the FDA with respect to opioids and tobacco?
So 2 very different stories, I would say. There are no patient advocates crying for tobacco products that will serve their health interest, for one. But 2 different kinds of stories. The FDA was only granted jurisdiction over tobacco products in 2009 because of congressional legislation. And the story there of how that actually happened might actually be a story that gives us trust in the FDA. For this reason, I would say that the movement towards that started with a leader at the FDA, Commissioner David Kessler, in the 1990s, who actually argued that the FDA should have jurisdiction over tobacco products because tobacco products were producing extraordinary health problems across a wide American population, and it was inconceivable. It was in error that the Food and Drug Administration was denied jurisdiction over this. And he worked hard first to assert jurisdiction over a topic that the courts decided he didn't, but it laid the groundwork for 30 years later, Congress actually, it's not just him, but it's a movement. So that's a story of, you might say, not just ethical leadership, but a decision to recast the mission of the FDA in service of it recast the jurisdiction of the FDA in service of its fundamental mission, right? The opioid crisis is a different story. It's the story of a deregulatory story that emerges in the 1980s, that picks up steam in the 1990s, wherein the FDA decides that, it's kind of shaped by the AIDS epidemic as well, that this alliance between pharmaceutical interests and patient advocate groups should speed drugs to market more quickly, and then we should let the market figure out whether it's a good idea or not. Well, that produces the peaks and valleys of the of a lot of painkillers that boom and bust like Vioxx. And the opioid crisis grows steadily over the course of about 20 years or so. So I would say that there are two different stories. But they both highlight the fact that the FDA, one of the fundamental features of restoring trust has to do with rethinking the scope and not just its internal practices, but really rethinking its scope and jurisdiction. So the FDA up until now basically takes the role of, we approve drugs and the market deals with the consequences. And maybe we'll do a little post-market review, but largely it's left to the Department of Justice or others to hold the drug companies accountable if there are problems. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's hard to trust a process that leans so heavily towards getting drugs to market and it doesn't have any jurisdiction over the consequences. Mm-hmm.
Well, that leads to another topic, which is accelerated drug approvals. Mm-hmm. Which is, as everyone knows, is bringing drugs to market based on preliminary evidence of efficacy and safety before benefit is confirmed. We've had more and more drugs approved under the accelerated approval pathway. Obviously, the Alzheimer's drug aducanumab was a kind of a unique situation and caused so much controversy. Holly or Aaron or Holly, what are your thoughts about the accelerated approval pathway? Is it a good idea to speed drugs to market? Do you think that again, talking about rules, are the rules in place today adequate, or do you think that changes need to be made to that program?
That's a softball question.
Oh, I know. Yeah, it's sure.
Do you want to go first?
I love softball. So yes, I would be happy to take the softball questions and leave you with the hardball one. I think that it is important to speed promising drugs to market. I think that it is vital that the FDA has the flexibility to apply rules differently, to apply its standards and rules differently in different circumstances. And as you said, the FDA has a long history of doing that. I think that the issue arises when when the decision making or the processes go beyond what the flexibilities already provide. And I think that in the case of accelerated approval, in the aducanumab case, you saw one example of that. I think the most fundamental problem with accelerated approval, though, comes from the other part of trust, which is the translation of trust to the community and the disconnect between what we who study the FDA know that the rules are, and what people and physicians and patients think the FDA has control over. And so it is actually, I think when most people think about an approved drug, they think about a drug for which the FDA is closely overseeing. And if there is a problem, the FDA is going to act quickly and take steps to change the labeling or remove the drug from the market. But what we know that the FDA doesn't actually have the same amount of authority to do that and the same kinds of of powers at its disposal.
Right, it's
to
the
act-
other side of
act
the
quickly.
it's the other side of the coin.
Right. So there's
Right,
this
yeah.
disconnect between the authorities and the power that the FDA actually has, and the expectations that people who are using the drug and considering using the drug think that the FDA has. And so, for me, the best way to try to fix the expedited approval pathway is to try to align those perspectives a little bit closer and make sure that the FDA does have the kinds of powers that people expect the FDA to have, and the ability to act quickly and efficiently if a drug that appears to have promise early on then subsequently doesn't. And right now we have a disconnect between those two things that need to be fixed.
So Holly, I've just appointed you. You've taken over for Janet Woodcock. You're like number 2, number 3 at the FDA. You're in charge of overall drug approvals. Congratulations. You deserve this job. You're there for your first week. What are you doing? What kind of changes are you trying to make?
Oh, wow, this is great. So I will say, I agree with Aaron that we do need to have a pathway that allows promising drugs on the market quickly. I think it would be an unreasonable thing to tell patients, sorry, we have to wait till we're sure that this product will benefit you. So to respond to your question, I think the first fix that I think the agency has available to it, even without Congress changing any law, is just to enforce the post-market requirements that are supposed to be part of that trade. You get your product on the market more quickly. You then ultimately have to prove that it works in a way that matters to patients. And if you don't, we're not going to have any qualms about pulling it off the market. The agency could do that now. It doesn't, for a wide variety of reasons, including they are people at the agency, and it doesn't feel good to be pulled in front of Congress and our constituents say that they want access to this drug and you took it away from them, right? It doesn't feel good to have patients saying, FDA, you're killing us, right? And so we have to keep in mind that there are people at the agency who have to make those decisions. And I would also make sure that companies are starting their post-approval trials before we grant accelerated approval, and that the trial design is appropriate to answer the questions, that we're not continuing to use those unvalidated surrogate markers, but the trials are designed to answer the questions that matter to patients. I think one really critical challenge of accelerated approval is that it is based on the idea that you can get post-market trials done. Companies might have their reasons why they don't want to do it, but patients also have reasons why they would not want to participate in a post-market trial. And so this is part of the reason why you end up seeing weaker designs, or you see confirmatory trials have to move to different parts of the world. And maybe we can talk about the role of payers in this, right? The FDA doesn't control that,
right? But
the idea that you ought to be able to charge as much as you want for your drug before you've proven that it works is pretty wild, I think.
You wanted to add?
Yeah, just to build on the point that I'm seeing developed here is kind of maybe even a recasting of what's the job of FDA overall. And I would say maybe one recasting that might help would be that the job of the agency is in the production of information, good quality information for people to make decisions. And that helps reconcile, well, on one hand, it's about saying a drug is safe and effective. Oh, but accelerated approval can let you put out a drug that you don't know is safe and effective. So how do you reconcile that? Well, our goal overall is good quality information production. So to pick up on the reforms that Commissioner Fernandez-Lynch is proposing, backed up by Aaron, so fine, we'll grant you accelerated approval because we've heard from the voice of the patients that they're willing to tolerate this. But what is the plan that is in place to produce the quality information that will finally answer whether this drug should be prescribed and is safe and effective? And I think the Biogen story was a story of, well, we might get that study done in the next 9 years, et cetera. The design of that study was still pending. We're not sure. And it just felt sort of vastly irresponsible. In contrast, I think there are examples of our phase 3 data are done. We're wrapping up the gathering of the data, but we have phase 2 data that could get ourselves accelerated approval. We'll get it out there. Meanwhile, we'll wait for the phase 3 data, and then the authority to say if the phase 3 data don't substantiate, we're going to shut this down.
So, Holly, for the record, I didn't appoint you FDA commissioner because I wouldn't do that to you. Too many headaches. You would.
We'll give it to Aaron instead.
Yeah, Aaron can take that job. Getting back to like communication and the way these kinds of things are communicated both to the public and, when you hear the term accelerated approval, we don't use the term conditional approval. We don't use the term preliminary approval. I think oftentimes, I know as a journalist, we have a trouble kind of explaining what that concept means, that, there's like a caveat, right? Do you think that that's part of the issue here? Is that we hear approval and the FDA has reviewed this drug and let's off to the races. But when in fact a lot of these drugs we really actually don't know whether they benefit patients.
Yeah, I think that you're putting your finger on, and a lot of the comments have put the finger on. They're details of the decision-making process, surrogate markers, expedited approval, emergency approval.
Right, emergency use. Yeah, sure.
That have become really flashpoints for both for public debate and misunderstanding about the process. However, the other part of the story is the way in which industries have been able to very successfully, I don't want to say manipulate, but maybe I'll say manipulate those processes in order to get drugs into the market, knowing full well what Holly has pointed out, that the willingness of the agency to exercise its regulatory oversight after the drug is on the market, when it has to push back against. When we say patients, we have to understand that those patients also have interests that often reflect the interests of the industry. And so there's a kind of a complex game here of the way in which small mechanisms that have been created for particular purposes and can often promote good health are also seen by the industry as just the route towards the market. And then, we're left with, and the other part of what I would say is too often, you can just run down the list of oversight, post-market oversight over the last 2 decades, and it's the Department of Justice that, sues and settles with GlaxoSmithKline for its failures to report on safety data for the diabetes drug Avandia, or its marketing of Wellbutrin or Paxil to the tune of $3 billion. So to me, that's a good example of what our regulatory system looks like right now. Getting drugs to market. If there's a problem, it's not the FDA that actually identifies the problem. It has to fall under the rubric of fraud or failure to report or some other kind of investigative pathway. And to me, that's a sign that there's something.
Should there be more, whether it's in the drug label or communication, that more indicates to the public, like that this is a drug, but that we still don't, the jury is still out, to sort of be very simplistic about it. Is that something that we should be thinking about, doing more of that?
Yes, I think that is essential, but I think it also brings up the point that a lot of this is extremely complicated and really challenging, and it deals with a lot of sort of complex scientific issues that kind of gets us back to the trustworthiness part of this discussion as well, because yes, I think that we definitely should try to do more to better communicate the limitations of the evidence of a new product when it gets put on the market, so that people can make the best decisions they can. But in reality, we can try to optimize that, but it's still going to be a very, very complicated, challenging task for a lot of patients, particularly in areas, times in their life when they're under stress as a result of their disease, as a result of other things that are going on in their lives. And so this is where it comes back to the trustworthiness, and are the processes in place at the FDA to ensure that the decisions that it makes are worthy of trust. And I think that this is where people like the people on this panel and other researchers and folks who study this area and policymakers can try to make the most have the most effect, because they can ensure that the rules are in place so that companies that have infinite amount of resources to hire lawyers to understand the nooks and crannies to figure out ways of getting around the rules are blocked at the get-go, so that the policies that the FDA operates under are as free from loopholes as possible, and that when loopholes are exploited, then they can be understood at a policy level and closed. And so, so that there is sufficient independence between the FDA, and this is where the sort of essential work that you do is coming in, like that there is independence between the FDA and the efforts to try to influence FDA decision both from manufacturers, but also from political appointees. This is why the rules and trustworthiness is so important, is because, yes, we do need to try to optimize that, but even still, there are just such complexities to the process that we need to be able to have an agency that's worthy of our trust.
You want to add?
Yeah, which maybe to broaden the, HHS is part of a larger entity called the Department of Health and Human Services, and there's another, I don't know which hand I'm going to give the FDA. The right hand, the left hand is CMS, Senator CMMS, Senator. And I think one of the other lessons that we've learned from the aducanumab event, given the vast size and scope of the population, most of them are Medicare beneficiaries, sort of CMMS got dragged into something that arguably they should have been involved.
It was another remarkable twist in that.
It was, yeah.
Saga.
But there's a lesson. Well, I don't like to say the lessons of history, but there's a message there, which is maybe in this desire to produce good quality information that patients, clinicians, policymakers can trust, there should be better collaboration between FDA and HHS for the gathering of data to better understand how drugs are working. And I think one of the sad things with CMMS is, we have this vast insurance database called Medicare, but it's actually all these little databases, the Advantage plans, et cetera. And the idea of having a registry in Medicare, is the equivalent of, camels through the eyes of needles and whatnot, et cetera. Surely we can rethink the way we run Medicare, gather data, to use it as part of the learning healthcare system that is America, to better inform when we put these drugs out, particularly with early uncertain approvals, is the drug doing anything? And I think a lot of the kerfluffle that surrounded CMS's response to the decision was truly, let's destroy the very agency. CMS will be, the proposals, for example, that CMS must pay for all drugs FDA approves that was thrown out there was just sad. I think we have an opportunity to rethink what the role of CMS and FDA are in conversation.
Could I
go ahead.
in?
No, please, yeah.
I just wanted to maybe broaden the scope to some historical perspective, because as a historian who has sort of thought about the expansions of authority of FDA, there's some interesting lessons. There's always been, whether it's, you think about the creation of the FDA, 1906, following the 1930s legislation, or 1962, there's always been a story of the accumulation of public dissatisfaction, that it never is enough to drive reform, but is then catalyzed by a crisis that trips the FDA into recasting, Congress actually, into recasting the mission of the FDA. And the story that I often think about is the late 50s, when Senator Estes Kefauver in Tennessee was trying to get attention to something called side effects of drugs, because he was concerned with the fact that physicians weren't adequately informing patients, that patients didn't know anything about side effects, and drug companies weren't interested in communicating side effects. And he had these hearings, and the president at Pfizer said to him, Senator Kefauver, may I ask you just not to get into the details of these topics that are clearly beyond your understanding and the understanding of the public, because you're scaring the public by highlighting all of these problems with drugs. And Kefauver responded, well, I just think that the public needs to know about the unintended side effects of drugs. And those hearings went nowhere. Kennedy was president in the early 60s. They weren't going anywhere until thalidomide happened. And thalidomide happened mostly elsewhere in the world, and there was one administrator at FDA, Francis Kelsey, who was notoriously resistant to approval. And that became the story of how FDA's expanded its authority, how issues like side effects, which we now take for granted need to be labeled on drugs, became part of how we regulate substances. And so my reading of the industry is the industry is always resistant to the kind of transparency if it undermines their sense of patient faith in drugs. But it often takes, it's usually a kind of a slow accumulation of different kinds of dissatisfaction. And sadly, it often is a dramatic crisis.
Well, do we need another dramatic crisis to motivate change, or
Please,
it's almost
no.
like I know. Well, it almost seems like we're on a sort of more of like a slow simmer.
It would be unfortunate if
Everybody
that's
taking
the
notes out
takeaway.
there, no.
Well, one could, it is, I wonder had Biogen's aducanumab not been approved, if Congress would have had the same will, impetus, and success in passing legislation for Medicare to be able to negotiate drug prices. Because I think that was a wake-up call. All these other cases, Duchenne's, et cetera, were always sort of, well, small ticket private insurers are going to pay. But all of a sudden, when America's taxpayers were faced with a bill to Medicare that was spectacular for a drug of, frankly, unknown benefit, I think it was a wake-up call that if the current system continues, it becomes kind of like a theater of the absurd. And I don't have evidence to say that legislation could be traced to that, but I have no question it changed the political conversation there. And so I don't think it's I think you could argue, as long as that legislation holds up, and I'm sure it'll be challenged in the courts, the Medicare negotiation for drug prices. I'm looking at Aaron because I know you're very involved in that. But if that sustains itself, you could look back and say that was the event that finally began to have a more coherent conversation of, if you're going to produce information about a drug, it's got to be worth paying for. So we maybe in our own American way have arrived at it through that. I don't know, Aaron, you may want to weigh in.
I do think it is very important that the pricing that we pay for the price that we pay for a drug is linked to the benefits that the drug offers. And historically, the United States has been the only industrialized country for which that isn't true, and we have allowed drug companies to price drugs freely and raise prices over time. And I am, I do think so. I do think that part of the discussion that we're talking about the levels of evidence and the information that is generated as a result of the FDA's existence and the rules that the FDA has before a drug reaches the market can affects that, because the value of a drug that we know, what we know about the value of a drug when it's approved is based on the evidence that's collected, and the evidence collected is based on the FDA existence and the FDA's ability to enforce its rules before a drug comes on the market. So I do think it is all connected, and as a result, the historic lack of a connection between the way that a drug is ultimately priced is, doesn't make a lot of policy sense to me. So I think that it is a really important step that we took with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Is the FDA sufficiently independent?
Independent from?
That's a very open question, but I think about that because the user fee reauthorization is going on right now, right? And it's this weird thing where the industry gives money to the FDA to review its own drugs, right? And every time the reauthorization comes up, we have this debate. New York Times had a big story about it a week or so ago. About whether that's the right way to handle this.
I think there's ways to improve, its independence. I mean, I would prefer it to not be reliant on the regulated industry for its ability to continue. And we just had this. The good thing about the user fee laws is it does give attention to FDA every 5 years, and there's the opportunity to fix problems if Congress is willing to act to fix those problems. And we just saw that it was unwilling to do that. And really what that meant was that the parts that benefit industry got to stay, and that the other things that could benefit patients, got left on the cutting room floor. So I do think that that's a problem of independence, right? When your bills are being paid by the regulated agency, that's a problem. I think Aaron and I probably disagree about the political independence of FDA, whereas I think it's appropriately situated within HHS, under the power of the president. This was a concern during COVID, right? When you have Trump ringing up, Steve Hahn and saying, when are you going to get these drugs approved? Like, talk about distortions of trust when you think that that's all FDA is doing. On the other hand, I think it's important to recognize, against these cries of FDA should just follow the science, just following the science is not possible, right? I mean, you should be informed by the science, of course. You shouldn't deviate, go in the opposite direction of where the science is pointing you. But what FDA has to do in lots of the examples that we've talked about is make a value judgment about, is there enough evidence for us to allow this product on the market or for us to pull it back? Who should be making that decision? Again, informed by the science, but reasonable people are going to disagree about that. It's appropriate for patients to have a voice in that value judgment. And one way that the public can have a voice is through elections and who is in the White House and who gets appointed to lead FDA. So I am okay with where FDA is situated. There are proposals for FDA to be made a more independent agency, which I think could be problematic, but there are others who take a different view.
What's your view?
Well, I mean, I think that the FDA, I think it's very important that the FDA reviewers, the people, the scientists, all the vast, thousands of people, the toxicologists and biostatisticians and all the different scientists who work for the FDA and are involved in making a decision at the end of a pathway. I think it's very important that that process be as independent as possible, and I think it is. And I think that those, when there are summaries that the FDA puts out about the information that it collects, that those are, I think that it is, we can trust that that information is being collected and presented in a fair way. And again, I think that there are some deviations from that, but hopefully those decisions are being made in an independent way. I think that where the trouble with the lack of independence of the FDA comes in is on sort of broader policy decisions about what sorts of information they're going to request, what sorts of areas they're going to exert their authority in, what sorts of areas they're not going to. What are they going to do about laboratory developed tests? What are they going to do about artificial intelligence in new devices? What are they going to do about advertising on the internet? Like those kinds of decisions, can have there can be potentially influence from political actors or other groups that have other goals in mind, that rather than the pure defense of the public health. So I think that when we need to ask questions about how independent the FDA is and what decisions the FDA is making, I think we need to think about what level that decision is occurring at, and what are the influences that go on at that level. So yeah, I mean, I think there are changes that could be made that can allow the FDA to be more independent in the policies that it is generating and the way that it implements those policies. But I think we can feel confident that in most cases when the FDA is making specific decisions about specific products, that it is making those decisions independently.
There's one thing I think FDA needs to kind of work through, and I'll give you an anecdote that sort of exemplified it. I had occasion to be present at a virtual meeting of a patient group, a frontotemporal dementia group, discussing drug development. And an FDA official was there, and a patient got up to speak of her experience. And all of a sudden, the FDA official got up and said, "You are why I am here. You are who I serve. You are why I get up every morning and come in here." And I thought, why on earth is he saying this? Because why would he ever say the opposite? Like, I'm not here for you. And, you're not why I serve. And I just want you to sit down. And and I thought, what on earth is this rhetorical display going on at this patient advocacy group where an FDA official is calling out an individual patient? She sort of was like slack-jawed, like, I just was here to tell you what it's like to have FTD, or my husband. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I remember that anecdote because it was so vivid, because it occurred to me, like, so how should FDA interact with patients? Is it whoever squawks the loudest in the room I'll listen to? Whoever, gathers the most people? And they actually have guidance, FDA, we found this document, PDF, of how to incorporate the patient voice into the drug approval process. And it's actually a very thoughtful, essentially social science study, or social science roadmap from beginning to end, how to get patient input into questions, which essentially involves a very social science method. I thought, now that's guidance, as opposed to standing up and having some display of fealty to you as an individual. And so it'd be nice to think about FDA, it would be good if FDA would be a little more thoughtful about what's the right way to comport yourselves with patients, because they are who you're serving, of course. The opposite would be absurd, but there ought to be some more thought about a sort of a rational, reasonable way to go about doing that, I think.
Yeah, the role of patient I mean, I'm sure you all experience this, and you see how organized patient advocacy groups our patients are, and their voices becoming more vocal in the review process. Certainly at AdComs, at advisory committee meetings where they speak at open public hearings. I wonder if you guys is any of that. I mean, it's important. I think that voice is important, and they serve a role. I mean, is there too much influence? I mean, I know it seems like it's. Holly.
I'm not going to say that. Trying to get
Holly
me
in
killed.
trouble with the ALS community, but I wonder. It seems like a pendulum. I don't know which way it's swinging these days, and how you all feel about that.
I think the issue is that FDA, as Jason is saying, FDA is not sure what to do. Right? So Congress is telling FDA, you've got to do patient-centered drug development. You've got to put out these guidances. You have to listen to the patient voice. And FDA says, okay, right, we'll try to do that. And we're going to have a patient representative advisory committee meetings. And we're going to have public comment periods. But what are you supposed to do with that information? If patients say, we want you to approve this drug, but the legal standard is not met, what is FDA supposed to do, right? And then they're in this terrible position of having to look at the patients and say, sorry, we know you want it, but the evidence is not there. What FDA should be doing, in my view, is helping people understand why they exist, because that seems to have been left out of these recent discussions. It is to produce reliable evidence that patients and clinicians need to make meaningful treatment decisions. And we've tried giving FDA less authority in the past, right? I mean, there was a point in time where we didn't have any agency that was looking out for safety and effectiveness of drugs, or we did have only a safety standard, and things didn't go very well, right? And so I think in response, for example, to the right to try movement, or these pushes where, FDA should just get out of the way. What are you doing here? I'm dying anyway, just let me try whatever I want. If FDA had stood up and defended itself, here's why we exist. It is to make companies who otherwise would go to the lowest common denominator produce evidence that you all need. And we can be flexible. We can allow products on the market before we're sure that they work, as long as we force companies to prove it later. That's, I think, where the patient voice can play an important role. But right now, I think it's been just left kind of adrift.
Yeah. So I think it's, I don't want to be maybe an apologist for the FDA, but I also want to highlight just how politically difficult the balancing act that the Food and Drug Administration often finds itself in, and how amenable to, how vulnerable to really the political climate these decisions can be. And to give you an example, what I'd say is, historically, I think that a lot of this started post-AIDS, at a time when there were no AIDS drugs, and there was enormous pressure to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, surrogate markers, fast tracking, getting experimental drugs to the market with an aggressive patient advocate group that was saying, there's, as George Annis, a lawyer ethicist, sort of wrote about this being a kind of a strange alliance of pro-market, deregulatory conservatives and AIDS activists all pushing to get drugs to the market as quickly as possible to address a key problem, a crisis. And that became a model for the way in which industry and activists realized that they had common interests, and if properly aligned, could bring political power, political energy to bear on these processes. And I'll give you one example of the way I encountered it in the 1990s. There's only one time I've ever given a talk to a conference that was sponsored by a drug company, and it was in the 1990s when Burroughs Wellcome, before it was GlaxoSmithKline, and they were holding a conference, and they wanted somebody to come in to give historical perspective on women's health. And I thought, this is strange, and I was asked by a friend. And they had brought together women's health groups from around the country. And their head of research got up and described that they were not a drug company. They, in fact, thought of themselves as a women's health company, because so many of the drugs they produced were dealing with and addressing health issues where women were disproportionately represented. And so they spoke the language of women's empowerment, and they spoke, and I realized what was going on here is the creation of the kinds of alliances that would, when mobilized under the right circumstances, be brought to bear against the FDA to ensure, right, not just that research was done, because they were building research relationships as well, but they were also building pathways towards drug approval. And of course, I had to give a talk on this, and I kind of gave a very cynical talk about, how patients' interests can often be manipulated by those who say that they're working with their interests in mind. But to me, this is an example of a continuation of what George Annis was describing that emerged from AIDS. And in some ways, I think we're still in that regime where those are the dynamics. And you can see how that can both produce trust in the FDA, but it can also produce a deep sense that this is the FDA process being manipulated and can seed distrust. And I think that's the dilemma that we're in. And my view is that it can often and more often be manipulated. And I think the panel here, has many different data points to indicate exactly the way in which this is not serving the health and well-being, and it's not faithful to the fundamental mission.
And one of those data points is you, our questioner. So we're going to
we're gonna
flip it around now.
Yeah, I think we're gonna wrap this up.
We're going to interrogate you now.
But I want to let's have a warm round of applause for our really thoughtful panelists today. They're great.
Thanks.
Thank you guys so much.
Well, I'll start.
All right.
So Adam,
The seat's getting warm.
yeah, no, well, no. So Fourth Estate, part of the fake news enterprise.
Yes.
So tell me, as you reflect on what you're reporting on FDA, and excuse my comment on fake news, but my point is that you're in a industry or a part of our culture, a part of our society that's been under vigorous attack and polarization. So, and yet, I would argue that the reporting that your group did and some others, such as Endpoints News, has been really instrumental for raising awareness and shaping the conversation. So, how do you negotiate the fact that you're in a group that on the one
People
hand
hate
is
us.
just
Like, how do I deal with that?
but on the other hand, you have this role in society of.
Well, I mean, like we've been talking. Obviously, trust is the big topic here, and as you know, I mean, it's not exactly the media is not exactly the most trustworthy industry these days. Or unfortunately, I mean, I think we just like scientists or librarians. I mean, there's all kinds of. My daughter is getting a master's in library science right now, and she sends me these articles about librarians under attack. And journalists as well. And I think it does, to some extent, it makes our job more difficult. But at the same time, I think we have to just sort of stick to the standards that we set for ourselves, and just to sort of do the kind of reporting that that goes to sort of seek out the truth of what's happening, and that's the underlying really people ask me like, well, how did you start doing all of this reporting about Biogen and aducanumab and the approval of what became Aduhelm? And it was a very simple question that my executive editor Rick Burke asked myself and the other reporters I was working with, and it was simply, how did this drug get approved? We had obviously done a lot of reporting before that, just on kind of the daily sort of news beat of the advisory committee meeting that Aaron had been a part of, that had voted unanimously against aducanumab and had recommended to the FDA that this drug not be approved, and then months later they approved it. And that was sort of the fundamental question, like, how did this happen? As reporters, you get that question from your boss, and he's not asking that just out of curiosity. That's like, you're writing that story, right? And so, and he sort of gave us a deadline. He said, you have a few weeks to kind of go out there and get the answer to that, or try to, as best you can, to help our readers and help people understand how this happened. And that's what we did. And obviously, it's we weren't starting from scratch. Like, we had obviously done a lot of reporting about these issues. We were very informed about Alzheimer's and like you said, the FDA reporting. So we sort of had a head start on that. But that's kind of what we tried to do.
So I have a question that builds on this, which is I started before I went to graduate school as a science writer, and it always struck me that there, and still is, a tension in reporting between what I call people who write about science because they're interested in the appreciation of science, and those who really want to promote an understanding of the process. And I've always been struck by the gee whiz feature of science and medical reporting, as opposed to the more investigative and thoughtful. And I'm just wondering your view, not just about what you do, but also your view of the field of those who write about these
I think
topics.
you have to. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people get into the field because of the gee whiz
Yeah, you're
part
not
of it.
gee whiz.
I'm not a gee whiz
No, no,
person. No. But I think I think that there's a role for the gee whiz, but I think there's that plus kind of the reality of the situation. And we get into we talk a lot about healthcare journal or press release journalism, where a lot of times these studies come out and we get a press release, and and we have to sort of examine that, and it's kind of oftentimes, and it certainly happened during COVID, where whether we got data on vaccines and therapeutics via press release, or we got them from preprint servers where the data had not been peer reviewed. And so the conundrum for reporters is like, well, here's news. I can't ignore this news. A company is reporting results of a major study. They're putting out a press release about it. I have to write about that. But how do I write about that in a way that accurately reflects the information that we have and also informs readers about what we don't know?
Right. And can I ask a follow-up about business reporting and how that
Which is what I do most of.
Right.
Yeah.
So business versus health reporting on these issues.
And you can't, I think, in a lot of these things, you can't separate the two. That that I recognize, and certainly Stat recognizes a lot of time, that when we report on drug development primarily, we are reporting it's a business, right? And these are drug companies. These are profit-seeking companies who are developing these drugs. Yes, they're doing it because they want to help patients, and I genuinely believe that motivation exists. But it's intermingled with the fact that this medicine, if it's approved, is going to make me $1 billion, and so that plays a role in it, and we can't separate those two things. We have to those have to be all put into context and understand that, and we try to do that. And I think certainly with the Alzheimer's, I mean, look, any very effective Alzheimer's drug is going to generate billions of dollars in sales. So that's a big part of the story.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, what I really want to ask you as an academic is how do you write so fast? Because it'd be really helpful to know how to do that. But what I'll ask you seriously,
the speed of the internet is what we do.
When you're writing a story that requires scientific expertise that you don't yourself have, how do you know who's a reliable source, especially if
we call you.
If they're contradicting each other, right?
Yeah.
And they're saying this is a huge breakthrough, or no, this isn't a breakthrough. How do you kind of suss apart?
I think that's part of the. It's just experience. Being a good reporter, someone and it's something it's a learned skill where. You learn to filter out the noise, and you learn to find credible sources, experts. Because again, we're not, I'm not a PhD and MD. I tell people when they ask me about my path through journalism, I was a poli-sci major. I didn't take a science class. I think I took a psych class my freshman year in college. I have no science background, in sort of any way. I've been writing about biotech for almost 22 years now. So you learn a lot, but you also do rely on finding really trusted, smart people to talk to. This became a huge issue in COVID, right? When everyone I can tell you, like, every reporter who had covered anything COVID-related had their inbox inundated with people who wanted to be known as experts and to be quoted in stories. And oh my God, we had to like filter, like who are these people coming out, who claim to know what's going on, and thankfully at Stat we have some really smart people. Helen Branswell, who's our like lead public health reporter, who really knows the field and knows who to reach out to and helps out. And so you sort of have to do winnow out and find, just ignore the people that are there just to sort of promote themselves, and then find the people that that can really kind of give you the information that you need. And that's part of for us is building credibility and trust with our audience, with readers. I mean, we don't, I don't want to write a story that is filled with errors or is being misleading in any way. I mean, one thing that I think Stat does well is that we have built up a good amount of trust with our readership, that they know that when they see a story in Stat, it's well reported, it's well written, it's informative, and part of that is like, again, finding the best people to talk to and to quote.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you are developing a story or when you're developing one of your articles, like how much are you paying attention to, how much is your approach, look, I'm going to lay the facts out there and let people decide for themselves, and how much do you pay attention to the tone or perspective, like what information you lead with as opposed to the information you follow with? Like how much do you weigh those things as you're developing?
I mean, as a reporter, I always say, like, people don't want to read a boring story. So, like, I don't want to write a story where, like, where it's, you sort of tend to lead with the most dramatic information. And, I think, again, reporting is storytelling. And so to get people's attention, you do have to give them some sort of dramatic arc and, like, just have a narrative that flows and that is interesting. We're not writing research papers. And so there is an art to that journalism that gets people to want to read your story. For me, like, I'm very news oriented, right? So like when I write a story, like I want the most important, most dramatic stuff at the top of the story in my lead or in the first few graphs. Like I want to like grab the reader's attention. Like I'm not one of these reporters who like, it takes 1,000 words to sort of just start clearing my throat. It's not me. And there are reporters who do that really well. And, people who write for magazines and, that, sort of building this kind of more of a slow sort of narrative arc. That's great. And it's effective. It's just not the way I think about things. I'm like, I want to get into the story. I want my readers to know really fast why they should be reading the story, and then hopefully give them all the information. Part of that is writing on the internet. Obviously we are a digital media publication. There's no print. We're not a magazine, and so people's attention span, particularly in the days of social media, are a little smaller than they used to be, shorter than they used to be. So I feel like you do have to kind of grab people and write in that way. But I think, again, I think we're trying to, yes, be objective, report the facts, but also put all of that into context, right? And oftentimes that context is pointing out what's missing, like what's not in the story, and just really trying to give people a little bit more value than just kind of this happened, but try to get into why this is happening. That's a big part of what we do.
So you're more Beethoven than Wagner. You get it hard.
Yeah. I mean, my editors, they know when I write a story, that it's going to have a newsy lead to the story.
So could I ask an ethics question to end with?
Yeah.
And that is, between the gee whiz, which is part of health and science reporting, and the scandal, which is also part of
we love
science
scandals.
Reporting.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the stuff in between. There's a lot of it. And especially what are some of the ethics questions, besides things like conflicts of interest, that you think either currently animate the science medical reporting or should?
I think those are important issues. When we talk to people, we want to sort of know their point of view and where they're coming. Again, something as simple as, have you been funded by a drug company? Are you a consultant? Are you, I think the preference obviously is to go out and find people who are truly independent to inform our stories. That's not always possible, and being conflicted is not disqualifying. I think as long as we can explain, to readers, so readers know, right? I mean, I want, there's sometimes, and it comes up in FDA issues, and I know it comes up with AdComs, right? Where oftentimes people, who can't be invited to be on experts on advisory committee meetings because they are conflicted. But there's good reasons for that, but that's also that those people have expertise for a reason. So that I think that's how we handle it. I mean, there's some people that, you need to have them in your story. You need to get their viewpoint, but you also need to point out to readers so they know, hey, yeah, they consult with, or they were the investigator of the study, so that information can be put into context. We try to do that.
Squeak one quick question in,
Yeah.
which is,
And then we do want to break the fourth.
Did STAT make a choice to stop calling it accelerated approval and to move it to conditional approval? Because that's what I've been seeing.
It's funny you should say that, Holly, because we try not to use jargon. Like my editor, Jason Euchman, hates jargon. He hates accelerated approval because he says what does that mean? Like that doesn't really, So we oftentimes interchange it with conditional approval, but then we'll sort of explain what it means, and it is it's a little bit, it's hard. We talked about this in the moment. We try to explain to people why, what does this mean? What does an accelerated approval mean? Yeah. And what it is and what it is not.
Another example is the New York Times decision to not use the term partial birth abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is hard.
These phrases get out there.
There's just certain terminology that obviously that we're all immersed in because we live it, and our readers are not, and we sort of try to think about that. Yeah. What does accelerated approval actually mean?
Well, let's turn it over to let's break the fourth wall, shall we?
Yes. Yeah. So we're going to open it up. I've got questions from y'all here in the audience, and we've got questions that were submitted in advance, and maybe we'll start with a question from the audience in advance. So here's a question, and I'll throw it out to anybody. How relevant to drug approval is the seriousness of the condition which the drug is intended to treat? At the extreme of very low seriousness of the condition, does the FDA ask whether a drug to treat is necessary?
That's not part of the standard.
That's right. It's a softball question, so I'll take it. So that isn't part of the standard. The FDA is charged with evaluating the evidence that is submitted to it and determining if it is substantial evidence that the drug works, and if the drug appears that the benefits appear to outweigh the risks, and so it'll approve the drug. So I think that where the seriousness of the condition comes up is in some of the issues that we've talked about today, about the extent to which the FDA will bend over backwards and be flexible about the data that it is, the sort of the rigor of the data that it's looking at, the amount of the data that it's looking at. Are there pathways that expedited pathways that the product qualifies for, and also, of course, the seriousness of the condition will also dramatically affect the extent that the FDA is willing to abide by safety issues with the product as well.
Right, sure.
And so those kinds of, that I think is where it all comes in. But the FDA is not in a position to make a judgment that a disease isn't serious enough, and therefore it won't entertain an approval.
And it might be useful to ask and highlight why, in terms of the ethics of why is it that a serious disorder, depending on how we define serious, to weigh that would be to introduce a kinds of inequities into the question of whose disorders are taken more, seriously, I guess, than others, right? And wouldn't that be part of the...
Conditional approval obviously takes in serious and life-threatening, gets you the opportunity for conditional /
Yeah, right, exactly.
And I think many were sounded when those regs were first passed, the accelerated approval regs. I was very interesting that it was about HIV. It listed cancer. And I remember back in the 90s when it came out, I remember Alzheimer's disease was listed there. I thought, that's interesting. And fast forward 30 years later, and the rest is history.
First question. Can you comment on what I perceive? I'm sorry, this is Scott from the audience from the University of Pennsylvania. Can you comment on what I perceive to be the FDA's blindness to considerations of race as a source of distrust? I'm thinking about the fact that they didn't mention the lack of black patients in the aducanumab trials, whereas CMS did, and the very narrow and ambiguous scope of their proposed regulation of menthol cigarettes. Anybody?
Thanks, Scott. You're gonna go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an interesting and complicated question. With regard to the FDA and race, I mean, one of the rationales currently being used in proposals to ban menthol cigarettes is not just the scientific information having to do with the fact that they're more addictive or more difficult to quit, and certainly the health implications that stem from that, but also the history of targeted marketing. And so this is, I think, a little bit of a departure in the FDA's thinking about what criteria ought to be used, in this case, in removing a drug from the market. And it's not a coincidence that this is a kind of a decision that's informed by the events of 2020, 2021, and 2022. But the FDA, if you go further back, has a slightly more fraught relationship with issues of race. And I'm thinking particularly of the decision to approve the drug Bidil, which was arguably a decision that was based on, well, the kind of suspect rereading of clinical trial information.
It was a
that
cardiovascular
drug,
right?
Cardiovascular drug that tilted heavily towards an interpretation that Nitromed, the company, was endorsing, and created all kinds of, because it was supposed to be a drug that showed, they argued, efficacy within the black population, and so it was widely discussed as like the first black drug for different kinds of heart ailments, and was widely panned as an argument. Also, so the questions of how the FDA has been sensitive to race, and part of the argument there actually was shaped by the idea that this is something that black patients want and black cardiologists want, and by the way, also Nitromed wants, right? And whether this actually served the interest of black patients or not is highly debatable. So I guess what I'd say is that the question of race in drug approval has many different data points, and it's not clear that they all line up in the same.
Yeah, I mean, getting back to drugs, aducanumab, I know they were criticized for having so few. It wasn't a diverse clinical trials.
Right.
We didn't even mention lecanemab in this discussion, the Alzheimer's drug that is all the news this week. But I know Eisai, the drug maker who's developing the drug. I mean, they actually pointed out that about 25% of the participants in their phase 3 study were Hispanic and black. So they sort of there was an effort to increase the diversity of that clinical trial.
I do think this is a missed opportunity, though, for FDA, right? They have guidance that encourages diversity in clinical trials. They could say, you don't meet the substantial evidence standard unless you have proven that your product works in a representative population, or we're going to limit the label or something like that, which obviously would have other issues, right? If you had race-based labeling more broadly.
The oncology division, I mean, Rick Passer that's been an issue, and he's spoken out about that. I know about when it comes to cancer trials of wanting the requirement of having the patient population in clinical trials reflect the patient population in the real world.
I do have a theory that there are lots of challenges around diversifying clinical trials, but if FDA mandated it, industry would figure it out pretty damn quick.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, this is kind of a little bit of a conspiracy-minded question, so I like this one. So, is it any stakeholder's interest to actively undermine trust in the FDA? So is anyone out there actively trying to undermine trust in the FDA? And why, if they are? Do you think anyone out there is doing that?
Well, I think the what we call anti-vaxxers would be one. A lot of the questions around both the efficacy and safety of COVID vaccines hinged on the questions of, like, should I trust issues like emergency approval or expedited, or is this truly approved? Now, speaking of interest, now my first impulse in thinking about this has often been to characterize these views as driven by interests having to do with fundamental mistrust of government in general, or desires to be sort of self-determination in terms of managing one's health, deep suspicion about science. But only recently did I begin to be more sensitive to the fact that there are economic interests driving much of this. That is to say, those who are advocating, let's say, ivermectin, there's a thriving business that is so that the skepticism around vaccines or the skepticism around approved drugs is also funneling people to alternative pathways. And these are multi-million-dollar businesses. And this has only become evident as we begin to look really critically at misinformation and the monetization of misinformation. So it's interesting to think about the fact that the skepticism isn't merely free-floating skepticism that is giving voice to kind of alternative views about self and governance. It's also alternative economic systems that are really, and you can actually trace this in things like the Alex Jones hearing, where you see the enormous wealth. And Congress actually has been trying to look at the monetization of misinformation more recently to try to understand what the interests are behind these kinds of skepticisms around the FDA and its rulings.
Well, right to try.
And I don't think
That's what I was, I was gonna say, right?
I mean, it's actually another follow-up question here. If someone brings up right to try, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, right to try, I don't think is a concerted effort to undermine trust in FDA. It's more a concerted effort to say we just don't need you, FDA, right? What do we need to be protected from? You know, the kind of tagline that the Goldwater Institute, which is the right-leaning think tank that it was, very successful in moving right to try along, was why should you, as a dying patient, have to beg the government for permission to save your life, right? And that was incredibly effective. At getting bipartisan support, this idea that these are patients who don't need to be protected, when in fact, it was just kind of obscuring the fact that FDA had a pathway already in existence for patients to access unapproved drugs outside of clinical trials when they've exhausted other alternatives.
But I think that argument is much easier to make if there's no trust in the FDA, right? If you can say, well, yeah, I mean, the FDA could get involved, but how can we trust that it's going to make the right decision? It's going to be conflicted with industry. It's got all kinds of resource restraints, and so it's that. I think that argument is a lot easier to sell to people if there's a lack of trust in the processes, a lack of trustworthiness in the way that the FDA operates. And so I do think that that's where that sort of connects back to the question of, what kinds of, are there efforts out there to actively undermine trust in the FDA? Because I think that I think that those are much easier kinds of decisions, much easier kinds of ways of bringing people to your side if there isn't trust. And again, just you brought up Alex Jones. I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the advertisers on those kinds of shows are nutritional supplements and
gold, buy gold,
and that are like outside of the bounds of the FDA, where there is a monetary interest to argue that there should not be regulation in this area.
That's right.
So someone wants to ask about the other side of everything we're talking about. This trust issue is maybe sluggish approvals, sluggish approval for sluggish approvals and or overly restrictive access, i.e. remaining, someone brings up mifepristone, slow OTC status of emergency contraception, et cetera. I mean, we talked about, speeding drugs to market, but what about the other side of that?
Right. Well, I mean, the FDA is the fastest drug regulatory agency in the world when it wants to be, and I think that there are, of course, the circumstances that you're talking about, and I think this this gets back to the independence issue because with some of these concerns about sluggish approvals and feet dragging, when you look into those kinds of questions, that's when you tend to find, unfortunately, excessive involvement by political forces or other forces in the decision making, because everything about the FDA is designed these days to make the FDA be as fast as possible in its decision making. So I would say that for those kinds of episodes, when you find those, that you digging under the hood to try to understand where what kinds of influences are being put on the FDA around that decision making can help explain some of those circumstances.
Anyone else on that? Is there a fundamental tension between the FDA's role as a regulatory body and its role as a public health agency?
No. I mean, no. I mean, I think that the role that it has is to be a regulatory body in the pursuit of public health goals, and I think that if the FDA were, and as we've seen in areas where the FDA regulation is pulled back, there tends to be public health issues that follow that, and the pre-1962 era we saw that as well. So I think that the regulatory role and the public health role are very consistent with each other, and when the FDA is operating optimally as a regulator, it is acting optimally in the pursuit of public health goals.
Sure, but I mean, it is distressing when as Janet Woodcock said, there's a force more powerful than the FDA, and that's the marketplace. Meaning, you begin to think of the FDA conceiving itself as its job is to regulate industry, and we serve the industry, the pharmaceutical industry. It seems to begin to push out public health as what its focus is. So I do think that, the agency's emphasis on innovation, that's our job, innovation. There's this force more powerful than the FDA. It's called the marketplace. That begins to not so much sound like our focus is public health, but our focus is the business of America, which is business. So I do think that
there is
the
a
tension,
right? That it's not necessarily a tension between being a regulator and advancing public health.
But what is your regulatory?
I think it's a tension between what patients today might want and need versus what's good for kind of the population of patients now and going into the future. So, patients today might say, yeah, fine, aducanumab, approve it, right? We've got nothing else that's a great option, fine, right? But you have to expect the regulator to have a broader view of what is this going to do to the drive of companies to produce better drugs, that give us more confidence in them. And that's where I think there is this tension.
So could I add that, to me, the tension that I see as most operative in the FDA has to do with the tension between any kind of regulatory structure around food and drugs and a fundamental kind of libertarian ethos that really pervades American society on the left and the right. And the idea that, there's a high bar that any agency has to clear before it tells me what I can't do for myself. And the FDA's mechanisms and strategies have tried as much as they can to accommodate that ethos by giving people different pathways, while also trying at the same time to create structures that ensure the health and well-being of the population. And there's inevitably going to be these tensions. And Aaron's comment about the FDA can move quickly when it wants to, and here's a good example that who remembers when the product Four Loko first hit the market?
That's what we're drinking here. It's actually in these bottles.
Caffeinated alcohol beverage. It's actually based on a Scottish, product called Buckfast, which is very popular and over the course of a summer, it was gone. And it didn't take very much at all now Four Loko is still around, but doesn't have that magic marriage of alcohol and caffeine, right? I mean, who needs a wide awake drunk anyway? But, so to me, there are instances in which the FDA can act very, very quickly. But no, when you don't have patients crying, and I think this is what separates foods from drugs in terms of trust in the FDA. One could say that, that fast move emboldened people and gave many people an expanded understanding and a trust that the FDA was willing and able to move quickly on the basis of a handful of kids who ended up in the emergency room, right? It's like, we're going to stop this before it becomes epidemic. So anyway, there's just...
The other side of that, though, I guess, is the whole, we talked about tobacco, but we didn't really talk about e-cigs, e-cigarettes and
Right.
vaping, and the FDA trying to ban, candy-flavored,
Right.
E6, but we actually had a fairly extensive investigative report recently in Stat. My colleague Nick Florco, who lives down here in D.C., that's there's still the companies are essentially just ignoring the FDA ban.
So here's a good example of where the devil is in the details in terms of how to judge and trust the FDA. So Congress has given the FDA jurisdiction, and it's also banned flavored cigarettes. Well, actually, it's characterizing flavors that's what's banned. I mean, cigarettes have flavors in them. And so one of the dilemmas that some advocates who are sort of in favor of enhanced public health argue is that the FDA needs to define what is a characterizing flavor. Because if it doesn't, it opens the door for what you see in some other countries where menthol cigarettes are banned, which is there's still menthol in cigarettes, but it's arguably not a characterizing flavor. It's merely a flavor in the same way that cigarettes have licorice, they have a wide range of other flavors married to the tobacco products. If cigarettes didn't have flavors in them, not nobody, but very few people would actually smoke them. So the question of what is a flavor and what is a characterizing flavor is something that the FDA, right, if they wanted to build my trust, might actually define and act upon. But these are the kinds of small decisions, whether it's expedited, surrogate markers. The details are really what determine, I guess, whether a product actually finds its way to market and whether it fulfills faithfully the mission of the agency.
That would be the most amazing moment in epistemics if you could define a flavor. I mean,
right.
Yeah,
you would know what it's like to be a bat.
My immediate thought that when you said what is a flavor is that the lawyers always win.
Oh yeah,
lawyers always.
That's true.
We're gonna wrap up in a second, but we mentioned briefly lecanemab, which is the next Alzheimer's drug, which we have been writing about this week, and we will be talking about and debating coming up. Your thoughts? We know how you feel about aducanumab, Aduhelm. What are your thoughts on the limited information that we've got?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a press release to go by, but if you take the press release as true and
a drug, by the way, which is also under FDA review right now. It's already under FDA review.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very different story of a well-done so far phase 3 trial that reached its endpoints, and it was amazing the detail in that press release compared to typical press releases.
Yeah, that was nice to see.
Yeah,
actually.
and I think another example of how I think the system is sort of working is the company Lilly has a drug called donanemab. They are going to get expedited. We're going to apply for it. I think they'll get it probably. And their phase 3 data is in the oven, waiting, and we'll hear about that in May. So those are, I think, examples of the system sort of working a bit better. Now, I do think, though, the lecanemab story going forward from September 27th, when the press release came out, will be a very interesting test in restoring trust. I hope they have a advisory committee. Despite the fact that data may be all great, we don't need an advisory committee for the first phase 3 disease-slowing drug that, in this, you want an AdCom to weigh in on things like the label, how should we describe the benefit, who's eligible, and part of that is just for that public discussion to feel that the questions were aired and heard, as opposed to we all had our private deliberations, met with the company, here's the label, et cetera.
Yeah.
I would just counsel them, the more public you can be about the things you're thinking about, the more you engage in discussion about them, the more whatever that approval is and the label, it's something that we can live with.
Yeah, and to show that that we can never really get too far away from aducanumab. I mean, the fact that aducanumab was granted accelerated approval by the FDA established this precedent of amyloid lowering as a surrogate biomarker for the approval of an Alzheimer's drug, and lecanemab is right now, well, as I said, it's under review by the FDA based on a study that only showed, that it's based on amyloid removal, right. Not on slowing of cognition, slowing of disease progression,
which the phase 3 study does show.
Right, and now it's also an example of maybe of kind of how accelerated approval can be done correctly, because the confirmatory study, which is the one that is reported on this week, it's actually already done. It's an unusual situation
Very
in that
unusual.
The accelerated approval process is still underway, and we already have the confirmatory study done and at least reported out by press release. We'll get more details in November. I mean, that's a very unusual situation, but it's also a nice situation in that we get a lot more data to look at.
I do think that as much as one would like to just put the aducanumab story in the rearview mirror, there are so many things to learn and still to learn from that, and it would be a mistake to just say, oh, it was a kerfluffle and a bump in the road.
As my editor reminds me, as we have more reporting to do. So, yeah. Well, with that, I think we will. I know we have about 30 seconds left. Again, I want to thank the panelists and thank the foundation for inviting us all to speak today.
Yeah.